in the context of people having a better life, a life that's good and healthy, both physically, mentally, and spiritually, some facts are more important than others. I would call these facts crucial truths. And what I've found is repeatedly these crucial truths are absent from most discourse, most education, most conversations, most debates concerning things of great importance. So, in the context of mainstream Christianity, Paulinist Christianity, there's a couple of facts, for example, about Paul's vision that he had on the road to Damascus that I almost never hear mentioned, even never pointed out. But they're extremely important to take note of because it really clarifies the whole situation. It really shows this supposed visitation by Jesus Christ for what it really is, which is basically a fraud, which then is used to justify his new gospel, which is an amoral gospel, or a gospel that basically abandons the moral teaching of Jesus Christ, abandons the greatest commandments, abandons his repeated call to develop our righteousness and even be perfect, and instead embrace this faith alone in the blood power of Jesus theology. So, on this road to Damascus journey and story, the two things that I would say are most crucial are one, that Paul says that Jesus quoted a pagan god in a positive manner, right? As I explained in the previous talk, he quotes Dionysus, and we're supposed to believe that that's perfectly fine and normal, that the Son of God, Yeshua HaMashiach, would quote this pagan god of drunkenness and revelry and partying and immorality, and it's just no big deal, right? But did you even know that that is what occurred? Did your church, did your pastor point that out to you? Probably not, right? Because if that was pointed out to you, it would be a big red flag. A lot of people would think, well, that doesn't sound right, you know. So that's one example of a crucial truth. Another is in that same story, he says that Jesus blinded him, right? So in Acts 22:11, Paul says, quote, "The light had blinded me," end quote. And then in Acts 9:8, this is repeated, this is confirmed again, quote, "When he opened his eyes, he could not see a thing," end quote. So here, Paul is telling us that Jesus blinded him, right? So if you're familiar with the ministry and healing work of the Messiah, you probably remember that he actually healed the blind. He didn't make people blind, right? So in Luke 4:18, John 9:39, Matthew 11:5, they all speak to Jesus giving sight to the blind. So don't you think it's odd that this so-called Jesus that visits Paul in the wilderness blinds him, right? So Jesus never quotes pagan gods at any other time during his ministry, and it would just seem completely irrational for him to do so, because it's actually a form of idol worship. And he certainly was no idol worshiper. And then secondly, unique to this story of Paul is Jesus blinding people instead of giving them sight, right? So if you can just think independently for a minute or two and not try and see what the Paulinist pastor is going to say, how they're going to spin this and rationalize it and make it out to be like, oh, no big deal. See if you can just not follow that train of thought, those logical fallacies, namely appeal to authority, and just recognize that this doesn't sound like Jesus at all. I mean, you couldn't be any more unlike Jesus, really. An idol worshiper that blinds people, right? Does that sound like Jesus Christ? Not at all. Sounds like the opposite of Jesus Christ. So that alone would, I think, wake a lot of people up to, well, wait a minute, maybe Paul isn't really a true apostle after all, even though he just gave himself that title based on this story of a vision that he gives, right? And then maybe all his gospel about human depravity, the inability to actually stop sinning, which again is actually slanderous towards Jesus, right? Because saying he quoted a pagan god in a positive sense is actually slandering Jesus. And likewise saying you can't stop sinning when Jesus specifically said repeatedly to people to stop sinning, right? Well, then that's saying Jesus is telling people to do something they can't actually do. So what does that mean? Imagine a parent telling a child that they should do something knowing that the child is incapable of doing it. Would that be a good parent? No, right? So it's this repeated underhanded slander of the Messiah by this guy who persecuted Christians prior to this vision, right? Imprisoned, murdered, right? Hunted down Christians. And then he supposedly has this vision wherein we have a so-called version of Jesus that is a idol worshiper that blinds people. And then gives a new gospel that contradicts everything he repeatedly said in his ministry for years. And contradicts, what the real 12 apostles, James and Peter in particular, were repeatedly emphasizing, which is that it's a combination of faith and works, and that we do have to follow his commandments, just like he said we had to, right? He said to love him is to obey his commandments. So we have this deception that has misled countless millions of Christians for centuries. But obvious red flags like this are just overlooked because, one, the church never points them out, never highlights them. And if you do happen to think about it for a moment, your mind might just revert back to appeal to authority and maybe appeal to popularity as well. Well, like, why hasn't no one else seems to have an issue with this, so I'm not going to be the odd one out and, raise my hand in objection, right? So it's these fallacies that support deception, and the deception supports abuse. And that's big picture on human society and just the world we live in as far as, the spiritual or religious context, is that we're constantly being deceived for the purpose of disempowerment, and that disempowerment coincides with aligning with abuse, supporting abuse. So abandoning the greatest commandments and slandering the Messiah is what the devil wants, and it's supported by these logical fallacies. And it's supported by the suppression of crucial truth, like highlighting these two huge red flags in the story of Paul's supposed, vision of Jesus. Another example of a couple things that are examples of crucial truth that really reveal a grand deception that has had hugely disastrous results is in the context of what we're taught about the Civil War, and more specifically, what we're not taught, right? So the mainstream narrative is that it was all about slavery, right? And they'll quote racist Southerners, night and day to supposedly prove their point that 700,000 plus people died, right, in this extremely violent and bloody war, all because they wanted to maintain slavery, right? So that's basically, the gist of the mainstream story. But there's a couple of historical facts that, if you just take into consideration, shows that to be completely irrational. It shows that it can't possibly be true. And one of those crucial truths is the truth of the Corwin Amendment, Corwin. So shortly after the Confederate States of America were formed in 1861, February 8th, right? First 7 states seceded from the Union, including South Carolina, which I'm pointing out for a reason, which will soon become apparent. And then just 20 days later, February 28th, 1861, we have the Corwin Amendment flying through Congress, passed by the House of Representatives. Then on the 30th, passed by the Senate. Then signed by the President, James Buchanan. Ratified by northern states, including Illinois, Abraham Lincoln's home state. So what's the significance of this Corwin Amendment? Well, only that it was an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that guaranteed the continuation of the institution of slavery for all southern states. Don't you think that's significant? Doesn't that seem odd? Doesn't that go against the narrative you've been told? If they were amending the Constitution so that they could keep this institution of slavery going, and yet they still rebelled and were willing to die in the hundreds of thousands and have whole, towns destroyed, go through like literal hell on earth, why would they do that if they were being offered the thing that they wanted without any hassle? It makes no sense. And yet we have all of this disinformation, all of these supposed scholars, all of these books. I have a book right here that I picked up. It's called Apostles of Disunion. The subtitle is Southern Secession Commissioners and the Causes of the Civil War. And it's just another propaganda rag, basically. And you know how I know that? I can just flip in the back of the book here, check the index. Let's see, under C for Corwin, Cooper, Curry. Oh, now we're on to Davis. Nothing, not even mention of the Corwin Amendment, right? And you're going to tell me this is, not propaganda? This isn't disinformation? These are apostles of disinformation by excluding the crucial truth, right? Because they don't include the Corwin Amendment in their narrative, because if they did, it would contradict what they're trying to push. And so you might wonder, well, why is there this massive disinformation campaign? Well, if it wasn't just about slavery, then what else could it have been about? Well, it was about the federal government not wanting people to be able to leave, right? That's what secession is right? The Confederate States of America became a separate country in 1861. They were no longer under the control of the Union federal government. Union federal government didn't like that. They didn't like losing control over all of those people, all of those states, all of that tax revenue, right? So, but just to make this even more clear, there is another huge piece of historical evidence that, again, there's so much information you can read about the Civil War, right? But some information, like I said at the start of this talk, is more important than others. Some facts are what you would call a crucial truth because it really takes the veil off of all of the propaganda. So Corwin Amendment would be number one on the Civil War. Number two would be Lincoln's own words in a letter he wrote. But before I quote Lincoln, let me quote the Corwin Amendment, just so you don't think I'm maybe misconstruing what that amendment really was, what it really said. So this is the actual quotation from what was the real first 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Quote, "No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state." End quote. Right? Persons held to labor or service. Held, meaning forcibly held, slaves. There's no twisting of words here. The Corwin Amendment was saying that no future amendment could be made to the Constitution that would abolish slavery. So therefore, it was guaranteeing it as a permanent institution, right? They didn't want them to secede, and that was their top priority. And if you can't just figure that out based on the logic of what the Corwin Amendment is, you could just listen to what Lincoln said in his letter dated August 22nd, 1862. This is his letter to Horace Greeley. Okay? Quote, "If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time slavery, I do not agree with them. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them." Now, here's the crucial part. "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or destroy slavery." Let me reread that for you. This is Abraham Lincoln. "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery." He goes on to say, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all of the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union." Right? So, again, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. Have you ever heard that before? Did a history teacher ever read that quote of Abraham Lincoln to you? Probably not. Just like they didn't mention the Corwin Amendment. Why is that? Well, maybe it's because the federal government won, right? And they run the education. And so they can set curriculum and approve of books like this garbage one I have in my hand here. Luckily, I got it at a thrift store, so it wasn't a big loss. That leave these crucial truths absent, right? Just like your Paulinist pastor at church never mentions that, oh yeah, Paul is saying that Jesus quoted a pagan god in a positive light. This Dionysus character, by the way, some equate there's some writing saying that could have just been another name or form of Apollo, and Apollo has been associated with, or some consider equivalent with, Satan himself. But that, as an aside, it just being a pagan god by itself, should make you wonder if Paul really was seeing Jesus there, if he saw anyone at all, if he wasn't just making up the story altogether. All right, I'll give a couple more crucial truths, this also dealing with American history, that you probably never heard. No one ever taught me this, right? I just had to learn it on my own, and then thought to myself, well, this is pretty amazing historical, these are some pretty amazing historical facts right here. How come nobody's talking about it? So, in the year 1913, that's when the 16th Amendment passed. What's the 16th Amendment? It's what established the income tax, right? Taking the money straight out of your paycheck. This was not something that the revolutionaries of 1776 agreed with, or even the Federalist founders. It wasn't even in the original Constitution. Even when the Federalists took over from the Anti-Federalists, they still didn't have an income tax, but it got put in 1913. So that's not yet the crucial truth, though. Also in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed. So a lot of people talk about the Federal Reserve and the problem with this central bank and fractional reserve banking, and some even claim that if we could just get rid of the Federal Reserve, we could, basically almost have a utopia just on that alone, right? Well, I'm not going to get into I'm not going to subscribe to that 100%. I definitely don't agree with the existence of the central bank, but I don't think it's the ultimate solution. I think it's part of the solution, but it's not the end all be all. What is the crucial truth that I've never heard anyone point out is that these two things that happened in 1913, the passage of the 16th Amendment, the income tax, and the Federal Reserve Act, which, and this is quoting from, I believe this is just Wikipedia, Federal Reserve Act signed by President Woodrow Wilson, December 23rd, 1913, quote, "The law created the Federal Reserve System, the central banking system of the United States," end quote. Okay, the central banking system, right? So I'm not just, making this up or putting a label on it that it doesn't deserve. That's what it is. Central banking system, this private cartel, basically, that can print money out of thin air and, pretty much gain massive amount of control over society by having this centralized banking. But if you, read any of these history articles, they'll just say, oh, it was, to stabilize the economy, prevent another depression, so on and so forth, this kind of thing. It's always just rationalized away, just like they rationalize away what Paul said and all the contradictions that he makes to the ministry of Jesus and all of the pro-abuse statements he's made, which were horrible, like just outright endorsing slavery and government as supposedly, backed by God. But what I want to point out here concerning these two historical events in 1913 in the United States is that they both just so happen to be found in the Communist Manifesto. If you actually look at that book, Karl Marx and Engels, right? The Communist Manifesto, an income tax and a central bank are pillars to their communist agenda. Did anyone ever tell you that before? Probably not. No one ever told me. I just had to discover it on my own. And then when I tell people, I just kind of get wide open eyes like, huh, that's odd. Well, that sounds strange. But again, it's like, but nobody in authority, including my so-called, independent media talking heads and, authors and journalists, they're not talking about it. So I don't know. There must be some reason why nobody's talking about it, right? So it's just appeal to authority, appeal to popularity, which disconnects your critical thinking and your ability to just make a logical conclusion on your own. This sounds like a major turn towards communism by the United States in the year 1913, right? Taking two major pillars of communism and implementing them both in the same year, right? Income tax and the central bank are not empowering the people whatsoever, right? Disempowering us to a great extent. It's actually a great social injustice. So, another example of crucial truth that is left out of history, left out of analysis, so that you just stay with the program. So you just think everything is hunky-dory, basically. Paul was a true apostle. United States government isn't communist at all. The founders of the United States, there wasn't any actual coup d'etat that happened between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Alexander Hamilton and Patrick Henry, oh yeah, they're basically the same kind of guy. When in reality, they were like polar opposites, right? So we're fed this propaganda, these lies about the history, so that you don't recognize, well, what's really going on, which is that it's a mass deception, a big lie for the purpose of continuing an abusive relationship that exploits and oppresses the masses. And in the context of Paul and Christianity, it's even worse than that, because it's dealing with the religious context and one's salvation. And people are following this false apostle and his false Messiah and abandoning the teachings of the true Messiah, which are, of course, crucial teachings, right? Crucial to our empowerment in this life, and in the afterlife. So I hope you found this talk highlighting these crucial truths valuable, and I hope you'll think about them on your own without reverting to, what Google says about it, or what your, so-called authority figures or popular so-called independent thinkers think about it and say about it. Just use your own common sense and logic and morality, and you can recognize that these are indeed crucial truths that disprove mainstream narratives. All right, thank you for listening. I had said that I would explain why I was mentioning South Carolina in particular, why I was highlighting that South Carolina was one of the first of several states that seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. The reason I was highlighting South Carolina is because that is where Fort Sumter is. So the Battle of Fort Sumter is referred to as the beginning of the Civil War. And before I go any further, I need to also point out the disinformation of even the title Civil War itself, right? A civil war, the definition of a civil war is a battle between two or more groups, right, within the same country, right? But this was a separate country, right? The Confederate States of America was a separate country. They seceded. And so it was really a battle between the Confederate States of America and the United States of America, right? We're just given this simplified, deceptively, whitewashed, skewed version of it when they just say, oh, it was the South versus the North, right? Well, it wasn't just the South anymore. It was the Confederate States of America, of which South Carolina was a member, right? So the Battle of Fort Sumter What was that? Well, military fort, right, in South Carolina, still occupied by the Union, by the United States of America, right? They wouldn't leave, right? And so South Carolina was saying, this is our territory, we want you out, right? So that was basically the basis of the battle. It took place from April, just for a couple of days, April 12th and 13th. And South Carolina and the Confederate States of America won the battle, right? The South didn't invade the North. The North refused to, it was basically the North invading the South, the United States invading the Confederate States, which was made even more clear after this because then they just upped their aggression even further. But the Confederate States of America were not looking to invade the United States of America. They weren't looking to take over their territory. They just wanted to have a foreign nation's military out of their territory, right? So that's what the Battle of Fort Sumter was actually about. So again, the whole purpose of this disinformation, of making it out to be just about slavery, is to get you away from the crucial truth, which is that it was actually mainly about denying independence to anyone that wants independence. And why is that significant? Because it holds true to this day, right? If a state wants to become independent today, look at all the opposition that comes down on them, right? So it's really about this centralized power restricting people from exiting the relationship if they want to. The Confederate States of America seceded from the Union peaceably, right? They didn't kill anyone when they seceded, right? They just put it on paper and said, this relationship is over. They filed for divorce, you could say, right? And if you can't divorce someone or organization peacefully and voluntarily, well, then what kind of relationship is that? It's an abusive one, right? So again, deception and logical fallacies are utilized for the purpose of supporting abuse. So the deception here being, oh, this was actually it was just 100% a moral cause against slavery. Has nothing to do with the centralized power being totally against people becoming independent from them if they want to. Another huge example of deception that supports abuse, huge example, is the misinformation concerning animals and humans and what the right relationship between those two should be, right? We're basically told that humans are definitely carnivorous, definitely, omnivores that need to eat the flesh of animals in order to be healthy. And not only that, but God approves of it. That's why the animals are here. God is totally okay with the torture, enslavement, and murder of these sentient creatures, right? A perfectly loving God has these animals here that feel pain, have emotions, and want to live. But we as humans who are made in the imagination and likeness of God are supposed to be abusive towards them, are supposed to inflict suffering and pain and death upon them. Right? Does that make sense? No. It doesn't, right? And the scriptures have been heavily corrupted to cloud this issue, that God never changed his mind from Genesis 1:29, which was telling us that plants are our food. A perfectly loving God doesn't think it's okay to inflict suffering, pain, enslavement, murder on sentient creatures for no good reason. But you might say, oh, well, there is a good reason, because we need to eat their flesh to get protein, right? So it's just nonsense. You definitely don't need to. People like myself have been vegan for well over a decade. We don't have protein deficiency, right? It's just nonsense. Oh, well, you need to eat fish. Fish also feel pain, by the way. It's a scientific fact. Oh, we need to eat fish to get omega-3. You know where fish get their omega-3 from? From the algae they eat. So you can just eat the algae. You don't need to eat the fish, right? Grand deception for the purpose of supporting abuse, right? Crucial truths like this, I guess in the dietary context, that would be a crucial truth. Have you ever heard that the omega-3 fatty acids come from algae that the fish eat, and that you can just eat the algae direct? Has anyone ever told you that? What nonsense have you heard about protein? Where are these people in hospitals, suffering from protein deficiency that are, on a vegan diet? Heart disease is still the number one killer, right? And what is the main cause behind heart disease? Diet. Vegan diet? No. Right? So it's causing this huge suffering of humanity, and of course the animal kingdom, right? Billions and billions of animals, land animals and fish enslaved and slaughtered every year for no good reason at all. But everyone has been bamboozled, been deceived into thinking it's okay, right? Because the authorities say so, because everyone else is eating it, and because every 5 seconds we got advertisements spinning, hamburgers in our faces. So it must be okay. Everyone else seems to think it's okay. Again, appeal to popularity, assuming that what's popular is good. It's just naive not recognizing who is the devil. He's a deceiver. He's a liar. Right? And who runs the kingdoms of this world? The devil. Right? If you believe Jesus, right? That's what he made clear to us. Right? The devil offered the kingdoms of the world to Jesus as a temptation. It wouldn't be a real temptation if he didn't have them in hand to actually offer. So we have all these institutions just pushing down this propaganda from the top of the pyramid through all the education and through medical establishment in particular. These apostles of disinformation, for what purpose? For supporting abuse. And why does that matter? Because God actually wants us to abandon abuse and follow the greatest commandments of Jesus. What are the greatest commandments of Jesus? To love God, others, and ourselves. The opposite of abuse, right? Loving action is the opposite of abuse. So the devil wants to do the opposite of what God wants. This isn't complicated. So you're following the devil's program, but thinking it's legit. And then when people talk about veganism, you get this immediate knee-jerk reaction, like, oh no, all my independent, cool journalists and YouTubers, they all put that down, and that sounds right to me. Even my pastor of church puts it down. Okay, so yeah, just keep on appealing to authority and not thinking for yourself, and not having any moral fiber to your critical thinking. See how that's going to fly, when you're faced with divinity, when you're faced with judgment. All right, thank you for listening again.